We did some work along the Hudson River at Camp Smith, a New York Army National Guard training mountain. There had been a facility-wide acoustic survey done back in 2016. Over half of the sites sampled had positive results for Indiana bats, and the wheels went into motion to accommodate Indiana and northern long-eared's needs with the assumption that they were widespread. But there's red flags suggesting there's more to this acoustic business than meets the eye. Here, Kaleidoscope inexplicably can't find the tricolors the other programs do. But the bigger discrepancy is that BCID reports 13 times more silver hairs than Echo Class. When call pulses are measured, in this case characteristic frequency versus call duration, there is overlap when bats use the same echolocation tools to extract information from the environment. With enough measurements, we see that certain confusing bats do indeed produce distinctive call types, but only under certain conditions. We need to recognize those archetypal calls and patterns to confidently identify the species. All of the other calls in the middle of the pack of the call duration, well, they are ambiguous and could have come from either species. On that project, the underlying call ID problem is compounded by call quality, which would have been better if the microphones were not on the ground. Also, they used what we now consider to be a legacy weatherproofing scheme with a microphone in a tube. When microphones are near surfaces, especially inside tubes, all sorts of constructive and deconstructive interference turns your sound recordings into mush. Keep microphones out of tubes and away from surfaces. Instead, get the microphone 12 feet or higher above ground, not stuck to the side of a tree, and not enclosed in a plastic bag, a tube, a plate, or anything else. Here, the fluffy vegetation actually helps break up echoes. In 2021, we refreshed the facility-wide bat acoustic survey. We did a large level of effort and manually verified the results. Kaleidoscope underreported 1/3 of the tricolors that Sonobat found, but reported 11 times more little brown bats. Kaleidoscope barely found the eastern small-footeds, while Sonobat found 12 times more. I could not find a single northern long-eared bat call, and the rest are here including either little brown or Indiana bat or both. In fact, all but one site had evidence of Mylu or MISO recordings. So, according to the software, they are everywhere. But so far, all we've really done is mostly confirm results from the previous survey. So, for 2022, we got to pick 17 of the best sites and catch as many bats as we could. We're going to do something that seems to be rarely done here, actually back up the acoustic survey with real capture data. And we did. We brought in great people, we brought vehicles to go anywhere, and we brought triple high poles, all of them. And we used all of them because the entire mountain is open woods. There literally isn't anywhere that was appropriate for just single high nets. Bats will fly alongside the nets looking to get around the poles. So we paid special attention to bury the ends of the poles into the forest, which paid off, as many bats were caught on the edges. Pretty much every one of the sites required 5 triple high nets to kind of clog up the reasonable amount of airspace, and so every 2 days we basically set 20 new nets. And I'm curious like a cat, so I set either a D500X or a Sonobat Live nearby to compare acoustic data to the capture effort. Big browns, we caught a bunch at every site except one. Acoustically, I could see big browns clearly in the data at all sites. And this is what we expect when a species is easily captured both physically and acoustically. Red bats, caught them at the majority of sites. Acoustically, even with just that piddly 2-night effort, we definitely detected them at every site. And this is where the wheels start coming off the train. Hoary bats. We didn't catch a single one, but I could find recordings of hories at nearly every site. This is a loud, easy to identify species acoustically, so it's a great use of the acoustic monitoring tool. The silver-haired bat, also a no-show at the nets and only detected maybe at 3 sites. And the tricolored bat, par for the course, a no-show at the nets, but definitely is present at 4 sites anyway. Acoustics will be biased towards collecting calls from certain species. These are going to be the loudest bats, those with the highest intensity echolocation calls. The lower frequency bat calls can travel further. The lower flying bats are more likely to contact our typical microphone deployments. And the open air flying bats, echolocation calls, are often most diagnostic. And disambiguous echolocation calls do not overlap substantially with any other species. So here we can see the tricolored can check off 3 out of these 5 categories, while hoary bats are even easier in 4 out of the 5 columns. And then there are our Fab 4 Myotis. We caught 3 little browns at 2 sites and a rather surprising 27 small-footed bats over 12 locations, the majority of the project sites. I'm afraid no northern long-eared or Indiana bats were captured, but wait a minute, that 2016 acoustic survey was convincing enough to start managing for northerns and Indianas across the entire property. And even as recently as 2021, our work indicated they were widespread. Where did they go? Back when the first classifier was released, there was a belief that distinct acoustic call types could be separated out, and acoustic monitoring would be easy peasy. Not long after, Sonobat's call collection showed some suggestion that the 2 species might be separated out in some way, and so we just thought it was a matter of time before the right combination of measurements would be discovered. We just needed more call samples. So we got them, and these are good long-duration samples from the more naturally free-flying, positively identified individuals that were tracked by multiple recorders. It's extremely labor-intensive to obtain call samples in this way. Unfortunately, by adding more measurements from more samples, mostly what we did was just fill in the data space that was missing. So now there is nearly complete overlap in many of the measures. There still may be some hope with longer duration call types, though, the ones that can be best obtained through the light tracking method. The ones that fall in the middle of the data cloud could be generated by either species. We call them lusos. Let's add the acoustic data for the lusos and similar small-footed, and just like last year, we could detect those call types at every site except 1. Given Myotis are actually relatively easy to capture, this result strongly suggests that this Myotis acoustic business, as my 10-year-old son would say, is very sus. No love for the northern long-eared at all in this acoustic data set, but should we be worried? So let me tell you a story about northern long-eareds. Back in the day, our friends in West Virginia surveyed 28 acoustic routes in or near the Monongahela National Forest over 4 years. But only 6 of those routes have ever detected a northern long-eared. And the Mon Forest folks were highly caffeinated. In that same period, they netted northern long-eareds at 51 out of 56 trap sites. They were the most commonly captured bat in the Mon Forest at this time, and what a contrast between the captures and the acoustic detections. So let's consider bats in the east that are difficult to identify acoustically. These are the quiet, the high frequency, the high-flying, the clutter specialists, and those that have the ambiguous call repertoires that simply overlap. Notice that the northern long-eared can check off 4 out of the 5 boxes here. This is one of the worst species in North America to target with acoustic monitoring. So at least a couple of takeaways here is that most Myotis can't be trusted acoustically, and diligent netting is probably better to resolve those species. Acoustic monitoring simply is not an appropriate capture technique for little browns and Indiana bats by itself in areas where they overlap. Certain species like big brown, silver-haired, and others can be cryptic, but they're largely overlooked in data because the focus is usually on threatened and endangered species. And some species are certainly best represented with acoustic monitoring, with the newly listed tricolored being a standout, along with the hoary bat. I encourage members of the working group to take these considerations into account when reviewing past surveys and creating management plans. Be sure common bats are properly represented in the data, not just the threatened and endangered species. Future surveys should certainly consider always combining survey techniques to capture the best representation of the species on the landscape.